So here we have Luka's trousers, and we are going to be altering them. I think something to note from the fitting is that the alterations that we did on Luka might look different to the ones that some of the viewers are doing on themselves, right? So I think what you need to remember primarily is that these principles can be applied across the board, right? So obviously you're not going to be doing exactly what we're doing today, but taking in a trouser side seam is a consistent alteration. However much you're taking it in by, the principle remains the same, right? And there are other alterations that we haven't done to this trouser, which we could have done. So we didn't take in the fork, but we could take in the fork. We might take in the fork. We'll see how the runs look. But yeah, there are other things that you could do and tweak that could benefit your figure, and in which case you should do that. I think the point of these videos aren't to create limitations, but to provide you with a basis of skills from which you can then go on to do different or more complex things if you choose to. But the presiding principles are going to be included within the tutorial.
I would say you just gotta jump for it. I mean, look, you will mess up. Like at some point in your sewing life, you will. But sewing is a skill and it's practice. No, just do it, man.
Yeah,
just do it.
Wing it.
What's the worst that can happen?
Nothing.
Exactly.
You bought a cheap suit, and inevitably it will end up looking good. It doesn't matter if you're slightly off the mark from what perfect might be.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of it's common sense, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully you'll be able to infer a load of other alterations that will be possible from the ones that we're doing. I always like to make a note of all the alterations that I'm doing on something, because it helps me keep a tab on what I need to do. And also you can see if you're it gives you a good overview of how to go about doing it, I find. And also when you take out pins, sometimes you lose the information without having noted it first and foremost. So taking notes is a super efficient way to make sure that you don't mess up. We have got to take in the centre back by 1 inch on the double. So that's 2 inches total, or 1 inch on the double. When you're taking in on a seam, either side of a seam, sorry, you speak of either taking in a full measure, so 2 inches, or a half of that measure on the double. And so when we say on the double, it means that we'll be taking this in 1 inch either side of the centre back seam. So take in, centre back, 1 inch on the double. Then what do we have? We've got to take in the side seam. So that's this out leg seam over here. And we need to take it in. So we're going to start the run all the way. You're smiling and not enjoying this. It's not the most fun alteration, right? Why is that? You're looking at it.
But the side seam.
Yeah.
If you like mess up the run, it's like, oh.
We won't mess it up.
Yeah.
It's a fairly simple process. Yeah. But it's annoying taking this in because we've got the pocket in there.
Pocket.
So we're going to have to take it in 2 steps. We can't just, not like on the centre back here, we can just run a stitch all the way down, right? Whereas here, because we've got the pocket, we're going to have to displace one side over the next, and then we're going to have to nip down on the double. This will make sense when we come to it. It's not that complicated. It's just a little bit more annoying because we're taking it up past the start of the pocket. We've got to start taking it in from the very top of the trouser waistband, yeah? And I've got to start pinning in. So I find a reference for my first pin. I measure from my first pin over here to the waist seam over there is 3 inches. And I measure 1/4 inch on the double over here to be taken out. So I make that note. And what that's going to do is going to be a first point of reference for what we call a run. Do you want to explain what a run is?
It's the line of sewing from the start of the seam to the bottom of the seam.
And we want this run to be as regular as possible,
yeah.
Right? We don't want the seam to start twisting in and out. We want it to be as straight as we can get it. So then we can find a second point of reference, which can be the point at which we suppress the most, which is at the knee over here. So I can measure down from the waist seam again, same principle, 17.5 inches, and then measure in at the knee, and I'm 3/4 of an inch on the double. So I make a note of that. And then at the bottom, we're going back to nothing, right? So I make a note of that. We've pinned more here, and then we slowly come out into nothing where the base of the trouser is, because we're creating a flare. Take out nothing at the bottom. So the next stage is to have a look at the inside leg and to see what alteration we did there. So we've pinned in at the knee, the same as we pinned in at the knee on the outside leg. So hopefully it should be the same. It's 3/4 of an inch on the double, right? Now, if you're finding you're pinning in quite a lot there, it might be worth actually taking that in all the way to the top, because what you don't want are sudden runs, right? Where the trouser's coming in very, very aggressively. Imagine if the trouser were laid flat, like this, and it was suddenly just to come in aggressively all in one go. That wouldn't really look quite right. So you might want to be taking in from the top a little bit further in order to make sure that that run, we're looking a bit straighter. And that's taking in the fork. So we might do a little bit of that today. The fork was slightly big on Luka. We didn't pin it out, but I think from the videos from the fitting and having looked at it, I think it might be wise for us to take in that fork by 1/2 inch total. So I'll make a note of the fact that we're taking that in on the fork. We didn't pin it, and we could have pinned it at the time, but in hindsight and upon reflection, I think that might be a wise thing to do. Another reason why taking in the fork would be good here is because we're going to be taking in the centre back seam all the way down and clearing the seat. And when we're clearing the seat, which is taking this seam in down quite far, you're creating more width inside the trunk of the trouser, so you can afford to take in the fork. But that's getting into the complexities of fit. We don't need to worry too much about that, but we're going to show you how that gets nipped in. And then the last thing we need to do is measure the bottom of the trouser.
So make sure this is all flat. Yeah. Okay, from the crotch, you put the tape measure right against that seam and go to the heel.
Yeah.
And that measures in at, what does that say?
I can't read from here.
25
and 3/4.
and 3/4.
So 25 and 3/4 inch heel.
Yep.
And then
you can just pivot that to the toe.
yeah. And how much is that measuring?
25 and 3/4 again.
25 and 3/4. Okay, so we've pinned the same. So there's a flat level to the bottom of the trouser. Typically speaking, you'll find that you're pinning it slightly longer in the heel so that it covers the shoe a little bit more, and higher in the toe so that it doesn't break against the shoe. But we seem to have pinned a flat heel, and that's absolutely fine. That's what we'll stick to, because that's what the fitting showed. So we can now get cracking with the sewing. So what I like to do is take all my pins out. We can start doing that. Cool. And here, brush out short marks, and we can start with the centre back. Taking in the centre back requires us removing cloth from this seam. So for that we need to gain access to everything that's available up here, right? And so we need to take the curtains out, which are this band here, and then the waistband linings. So they might look different from trouser to trouser, but the essence is the same. You're just removing whatever's here in order to access it. In this case, the linings are secured on top of the waistband afterwards, but in certain ready-to-wear trousers, they're all part of the same element. So it's just a case of lifting all of this up in one go. But you can have a look at your trousers and see how yours are made up. The principle remains the same. Start unpicking that.
This.
Yeah. So you're taking these tacks off, and then you're unpicking down this centre back seam if there is one, and then you're taking the curtains off here, and you're taking the waistband lining off there.
Cool.
And I can start unpicking the trouser bottoms. You said you did pole dancing.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any accidents?
I guess like as soon as I stopped doing it, that's the time when I started going upside down.
Right, okay. No slap bang on the floor.
I
neck
think
first.
I did that once.
You did?
I did that once. It's a rite of passage. There was a move where like I had to like throw my hips upwards, like put my knee around the pole and then like twist my legs around it and then stick my arms out to reverse crucifix.
Nice.
Anyways, yeah, clearly my like grip strength between my thighs weren't good enough. And I just hit the floor.
It's funny how it can be like one of the most beautifully sexual things ever, and simultaneously, within a moment, can be one of the most unsexy things ever.
Oh my god, yeah. Like I filmed myself doing it just to see like, oh, this is so cool, because it feels really cool. And then you watch it back and you're like, I'm like floundering around, like just like twirling around a pole.
Are we all open? Yes, we're all open.
She's free.
Great. So we now have access to this. We just need to unpick the felling right at the top over here. And you'll see what I mean by access. There. Bam. And hey ho, there we go. So that's the seam now pressed flat like that. So we have access to it. So what we're going to do is put one leg inside the other. So literally put your hand inside the leg, grab the other leg and flip the trouser inside. And then you'll be able to lay the trouser flat on the board like this. Once it's flat on the board like that, you'll then come over here, get all of those gubbins out of the way, and then we're going to spray a little bit of water on it. If you've got steam in your iron, that's good as well. And you're going to press down the seam and make sure that both your layers of fabric, which are sitting on top of one another, are flat. And we want to press it all the way into the start of that curve, down there to there. Now this is the first run that we're going to be working on, and you'll see what we mean when we say we want nice and straight runs. So we need to take this in by, refer to my little notebook, 1 inch on the double. I apply my tape measure from the seam inwards, 1 inch out. So you can see measuring from where the stitch is to where my chalk mark, 1 inch. Now this is taking it in when you place your stitch inside of the trouser. If you want to let it out, you place your new stitch outside of there. So all of this is inlay, it's excess. You don't necessarily have this on trousers, which is why we say go bigger, because you definitely can take things in. You can't necessarily let things out. But if you've got this, it means you can let this out. So we're going to take it in by that 1 inch. We then grab the trouser, lay it flat. And from about the start of the curve over here, we want to gradually come out. So what we're going to do is grab a little ruler and direct that in a gradual way into that curve over here. Like so. Doop, doop, doop. And then we continue it slowly into there. And that is our even run. It's straight-ish, almost. It's impossible to get it perfectly straight, but you want to get it as straight as you can. Obviously you're going to curve in here, but you want a gradual, sort of slow curve to it. Next step is to stitch this. So from the point where the stitch joins up the original line, we're going to start back stitching all the way up into here. And we do this before we remove this stitch, and that holds the trouser in place. If you've got a machine, you can machine this in place as well. And you do the same thing as you would with a back stitch. You do 2 stitches, one on top of the other. Reason being is that this seam is under a lot of pressure, a lot of load, and can split quite easily. So it's important that you sew 2 stitch lines exactly one on top of one another. So you start over here and you head all the way up. And the other point of weakness is right at the top of the band. So you need to secure this down with quite a few back tacks and make sure that it doesn't come apart. Once we've done that, we're going to have to trim down, in this case, our inlays. There's a lot of fabric left here. Now, you typically don't want more than 2 inches left over. So we're going to remove some of the excess in the trouser to make sure that it doesn't cause disturbances later down the line. So I mark 2 inches past here, and I join it down in a gradual way to there. You never want less than 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch between your stitch line and the edge of your cloth, right? That's your seam allowance as a minimum. So we're going to cut that out.
What do we do about the overlocking that's now gone?
So we're going to assume that people don't have overlockers. So overlocking is this stitch that you can see there, which prevents the edge from fraying out, right? So on this side, you can see that that can all come apart, whereas this side can't. Now, to make up for the fact that we don't have this stitch, we're going to do a stitch called a
Whip stitch.
or we could blanket stitch it. There's a number of stitches that you could do, but the easiest, most simple one is a simple serge. And it's one of the easiest stitches around. And we'll show you how to do that in a second. But for now, we're going to start by stitching this line before our chalk comes out.
This part's going to be really hard.
That part will be hard.
That part's for a thimble.
So you'll have to go in and out, in and out. You can't do it in one swift go.
Do you think it's worth pinning?
You can pin
Or
it.
pinning all this down?
Yeah.
Because it may shift.
Yeah, absolutely. So Phoebe's going into the start of that stitch and starting in the original stitch line, right?
Yep.
So that it doesn't start undoing. You're going to back tack.
Yeah.
And then, as we showed you in the initial video, back stitch all the way along that seam. Single thread, as always.
I always dread this part when I'm on the machine, and for some reason it doesn't stitch here.
You need to lift the foot.
Lift the foot while I do it.
Yeah, ever so slightly. You can stab stitch through, which is essentially exactly the same as a back stitch, except that you're going in, coming out the other side, then coming back out a little further along.
Oh, yeah, you really
that's
need
tough.
You need a
You need
thimble
a
for this
thimble.
one.
And then pulling that out. And so the motion's exactly the same, except you're doing it in 2 steps rather than 1.
2 motions.
So how long does this seam take you? Like,
Really not that long. The back stitch is really fast.
and if you're like just watching a Netflix series, it's not too bad.
Yeah,
Is it?
like hand sewing is really relaxing. Until you get bored.
But you won't get bored because it's your own clothes.
Yeah.
And there's the excitement of wearing them.
Do you bar tack across this?
What do you mean? Oh, yeah, you can bar tack that if you want. So bar tack is a little loop of threads, right? That holds things in place. The Italians do that a lot. But we're just going to back tack a few times right at the top to hold it in place. You can now come over and then loop here a few times, just over the band.
Oh.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yep. And then you come back over. Yep. Three. And maybe a 4th time. Yes. Safety, otherwise you've got a bare bottom
Yeah, there we go.
at the wedding. Not ideal. And then back tack inside that cloth. So don't come all the way through, just come to the top layer. Yeah, just back tack there. Just hold it all in place.
Yeah, this is going nowhere. Not you. There. Is that okay?
Great. And now all you have to do is do it again.
Yeah, I was thinking this is a bit wide.
So take the pins out so it's easier for you to sew and do exactly the same thing to hold it nice. What's good is to go in and out of the areas that you didn't go in and out of. So it's a stitch between the stitches. Does that make sense? So if you went into the cloth here and came out of the cloth there, you come in between where you went in and came out.
Can you pass me the thread? I'll try that.
Try it. We've now stitched this, right? So we're going to do two things. First, we're going to unpick this original seam, and then we're going to serge the edge, right? So we can start unpicking that. I'm going to start at that end. I'll start at this end. Great. Okay, so now serging. Serging's really silly. Knot. And then we start from where the overlocking gets cut away. And we simply, like this, serge the edge. So we come in just a little bit further than where we went in, all along the way. So we're about 1/4 of an inch along the cloth, and we're about 1/4 of an inch inside of the cloth. And this, without making it tight, because otherwise it makes a cloth furl onto itself, this holds the threads in place. Like a pad stitch on the edge, basically.
Oh, so that's it.
That's all it is. Like that. Okay, so we are now serged, and we're going to press the seam open. So now, so we take that leg out of the other, and we lay this flat. Make sure that there's nothing behind it, and then we press the seam, pull the seam open like this. Wet it, so you can spray some water on it, or you can steam it if you've got steam in your iron. That works just as well. And delicately, can be a little bit tricky, move all this out the way and press it open. Make sure it's pressing nice and flat. Can be a little bit tricky. What helps is to do this on the edge of an ironing board. So I am going to cheat and use my sleeve board. Shove it on the end, like that. Put it nice and open, and then continue along. Go. Once it's pressed on one side, do it on the other. Before we do that though, I am going to neaten up all of these curtains and waistband linings. So I'm just gonna press these flat again. And there we have it. So that's our waistband taken in. Next step is to finish off the linings at the back. So flip it back over. Your trouser might look different to this one, but the principle is exactly the same. You just need to cover everything back in as it originally was. So I'm literally just going to tack the inlays back down against the waistband. So I'm going to put a tack in here, attaching the inlay back against the waistband behind it. There. Same on this side. So make sure that that's sitting flat. There. Get the linings out of the way and tack this back down. You only want to catch the top layer of cloth. You obviously don't want this visible from the other side. And that just keeps it flat against the back. And then grab some basting cotton and we fold the waistband linings back in as they were. First, get the curtains in, so this bottom layer. So place that down, make a pleat in it. So usually along the center. So you place one fold there. It's a bit tricky, you get there eventually. One fold there. A second fold here, which is called a box pleat. Now, the linings are messy and that's inevitable. Unfortunately, some linings just never get clean again. So don't worry about what they look like. It's not really very important, ultimately. So get them looking as neat as you can, and then basting cotton, tack them down to the inlay that sits behind. At the pleat that I've made, I'm just going to add another little tack to keep it in place. There, and then tack it all the way to the end where we undid it. Like that. And then for the waistband lining, it looks like there's a little bit too much here. So what I'm going to do is trim a little bit back. So we only need 2 inches either side. So if we see where it was split here, I'm just going to trim back 1 inch either side up here. I'm going to lay one layer flat against the other. So that on top. Press that down and fold it back. And that means we can still let it out at a later date. So, base at the top. And then base down. And then back across. I'm just going to quickly baste over here as well, so it makes it easier for us when we fill. This is all not secured yet. And here. Right, there we have it. Get the crease into the pleat. And now we fell. Down from where we took it out, all the way down here and across, and then down the middle, down from here all the way across to there. And then when we do this one, we just want to make sure that we're catching the cloth that's behind. So we're tacking all the layers down to the inlay of the waistband, right? We don't want to come through to the other end of the trouser so that it's visible through here, but we just want to catch the lip over here that's on the other side. And then we'll finish it all off with a little tack inside of the pleat over here to stop it from all coming up when you're wearing it. Great. So Phoebe's done a fab job of attaching all of this back down, and she's gone through to the inlays, so this can't come off anymore, which is fab. So now all that's left to do is over here a few tacks just to hold the edge of that pleat in place. And we only want to catch the inlay. So we don't want to come through to the other side of the trouser. We only want to catch the inlay, not come through to the face of the trouser. And also you don't want to pull this tight, you just want it slightly loose. Come in, and then I just fell down. And as I said, my needle is coming through on the inlay, it's not coming through to the other side. Back tack a few times. Snip. Remove your bastes. And you just reduce the waist in your trouser. Simple as. Cool. So next stage is to take in the leg line. So how do we go about doing that? The difficulty in this pair of trousers, and the alteration that we're going to do here, lies in the fact that we're going to have to take in at the height of the pocket. So anything you're taking in below here can simply be taken in on the double. So either side of the seam, like we did with the centre back seam. You would start from the point where the pocket starts and then you'd come in, right? The problem we have is that you can't take in where the pocket is. Otherwise you're going to take out the pocket, right? So we can only take it in on the underside, on the behind of the trouser. So we need to move the behind of the trouser inwards so that we don't interfere with the pocket, to remove that little bit of cloth that Luka didn't want there. So how we go about doing that, we have a look at our notes and we need to decide on the alterations. I've made a mark that at 3 inches down, we're taking it in 1/4 inch on the double. Measure down 3 inches, and I know that here I need to come in 1/4 inch on the double, so 1/2 inch. Coming out, there. And then we're going to go to our next point, which is 17.5 inches down. We want to take in 3/4 inch on the double. Now, we're going to be clever with how we go about doing this. 3/4 inch on the double is 1.5 inches total, right? Now, if I am already taking in 1/2 inch here, I'm going to carry that 1/2 inch through all the way. Yeah, so let's place that already there. So I've already deducted, what this is going to do is it's going to give us an even run between both sides of the trouser. So I'm going to deduct that 1/2 inch there, which gives me 1 inch to take away total. So that's 1/2 inch on the double that I need to take out, and I'm going to distribute that either side. So in effect, I'm going to be taking in a 1/2 inch from the top side, and I'm going to be taking another 1/2 inch out on the underside. And that's going to give me my 1.5 inches out. So we're going to go to this point here on the top side, and this point here on the underside, from that point there. And that's going to give us a nicer run into the leg. Yeah. Then we're going to come to our bottoms. We have a heel of 25 3/4. So I'm going to mark where the 25 3/4 comes into the leg. So we're going to measure down to our heel, which is 25 3/4.
Cool.
Great. So we're going to pop a pin in here, just so we can transfer the approximate bottom of the trouser to the other side. And we said that we wanted a flare. So this is going to be the bottom of our trouser, is this point over there. We said we wanted a flare into nothing at the bottom. So when we come into this point, we're going to come right back into the seam. So let's draw these lines in. So these are the alterations visualized from the outside leg that we're going to be performing on the side seams. So this isn't how you would mark it up. This is just for the purposes of this video so that you can see what we're going to do. So we're going to brush these out. But we're going to show you the same lines on the inside leg of the trouser. On the inside leg of the trouser, we noted that we wanted to take in the fork, which is the area over here, right at the height of the inside leg. We wanted to take it in by a 1/2 inch, and we wanted to take in the knee by 3/4 inch on the double. So we're going to mark those alterations in so you can visualize them. But again, this wouldn't be something you usually do. It's so that you can see the alteration that we're going to make. So mark in our 1/2 inch where we're taking it in at the fork. And we're going to take that 1/2 inch mark down to our knee. Now, how I found the knee point was simply by putting a pin in here where we marked the knee on the other side when we were making the first alterations. We know we've got a 3/4 inch on the double alteration to make, which is 1.5 inches total. 1.5 inch total to take out of this area. Now, because we took in a 1/2 inch at the fork, we're going to carry that 1/2 inch down at the knee so that the alteration is split evenly between both sides of the seam and that the runs are smooth. So we have to now deduct that 1/2 inch, which we're already taking out on the underside. That leaves us with 1 inch left to remove. We then split this 1 inch evenly between both sides of the seam. 1 inch divided by 2 is a 1/2 inch. So we add a 1/2 inch to this side, and then we take a 1/2 inch out of that side of the seam. And we've now split the alteration evenly between both ends. And that's the alteration that we're going to be doing to the trousers on the inside leg. So to mark the alterations up properly, we're simply going to start by turning the trouser inside out. So if you're making uneven alterations on either side of the seam like we're doing, you're going to have to rip the seam open all the way to the very base of the waistband so that you can access the seam where you need to. However, if you're only making the alteration split on the double from below where the pocket starts, you can leave the trouser sewn together and you can simply start taking it in from the point at which the trouser pocket ends and mark the alterations up, like we did on the centre back, by pressing the seam flat, drawing in where your line goes and sewing it together. You would then undo the original stitch, press the seam open, just like on the centre back, and your alteration would be done. On the inside leg, if you're taking in a fork, it's usually being taken in not on the double, but it's taken in entirely on the underside. So you will have to split the seam open in any case. However, if you only need to take in the trouser leg at the knee and don't require to take it in at the fork, then you can press this flat and do exactly like I described earlier on the outside leg and take that seam in on the double by marking it through, pressing it open once you've sewn that new line after having ripped out the original seam. But for now, we're going to be ripping the inside leg and the outside leg open.
I've got like horror stories of unpicking trousers like that. It just like rips everything apart. Inside leg as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have ripped the inside leg seams and the outside leg seams open, but in order for us to alter the inside leg, we need to remove some of the gubbins that are in here. So just untack them, all of these linings. You might not have them, but we do. And you're going to have to cut open the seat seam ever so slightly in this area in order to free up that seam entirely. Like that. So we've now got all these seams ripped open. Looks like a scary state, but don't worry. First things first, we're going to start marking the alterations on the top side. We'll just be doing this to one side, but you'll do it symmetrically between both sides. Grab your top side and lay it flat. Now, you might have slightly different seam allowances than the ones that we have on our trouser. So before you press the seams flat, that is to say, make that go this way, you're going to mark the alterations in. As we said, we're starting the alterations on the top side from below the pocket, and we're coming in at the knee, so 17.5 inches below the waistband by a ½ inch. So I measure 17.5 from the waistband down and make a little mark. And I know I need to come in a ½ inch from my original stitch line. On this pair of trousers, which is likely to be the case on yours, there is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is standard. So I come to my original stitch line here, which is in the fold of the seam, and I mark a ½ inch inside of that. There. I then come to the very top of my pocket, and what I want to do with my chalk is create a nice and even run coming into that ½ inch. I know that my trouser hem is sitting 25 3/4 inches down from the inside leg. So I measure down the inside leg from where the seam was to there, and I make a mark. I then transfer this across and I know that I need to come very smoothly back into the original stitch line at the bottom. And so I draw a line smoothly, which comes back into that point. Like that.
Have you got any advice for how to draw a smooth line in case people don't know how to draw that?
Sharp chalk, as we said, you sharpen it, and then you can use rulers to try and help you out, but doing it by eye, I think, is the easiest thing for me.
Easiest way.
So now that you've done that, you can start marking the inside leg. So the inside leg on the top side does not change at the fork, but it does come in a ½ inch at the knee. Now we have our knee placement over here, which we can transfer across, and it needs to come in by a ½ inch at that point. So I come in a ½ inch from my original stitch line, and I draw a chalk run coming in to that point, and then coming back out to the original line at the knee. Now this we can use. Sometimes it's not ideal, but certain runs are so gradual that you can use a ruler for them. So we've now marked the alteration to our top side. We can now press all the seams flat. We'll give them a little spray. Once those seams are pressed open, you can now, as I said, transfer those marks exactly the same to the other side and start on the underside next. So we apply exactly the same principles. So we come 3 inches down from our waistband, over here on our outside leg, make our mark, and we need to come in about 1/2 inch in from that point. Then 17.5 inches down, we're on the underside going to be 1 inch in from that point. And then at the bottom, so we mark in our inside leg, 25 3/4, and transfer the mark across. We come into 0 at the bottom. So we now come to the very top and draw a gradual line connecting all of these points from the original line right at the top, as high as you can get, to our reference point 1/2 inch in, and graduating very smoothly into the knee, and then into nothing at the hem. Like so. We then do exactly the same thing as we'd marked initially on our inside leg. So we undo the inlays like that. So we wanted to come in 1/2 inch at the very top, and then at the knee we wanted to come in 1 inch. So I come 1/2 inch in, and then a 1 inch at the knee, and back into nothing at the base. Like that. And now we can press these seams flat and transfer them over to the other side of the trouser. So we've now drawn the lines on all 4 legs, and we removed all the old stitches and flattened all the seams. So now what we can do is start assembling the legs together. In order for us to do this, we grab one side, top side and underside, like this, combine them, and pin them together, stitch line to stitch line. So we have our stitch mark here at the very top of the pocket, and here our stitch mark on the underside. And we're going to grab some pins, flatten everything against one another, and pin the stitch mark on one side inside the stitch mark on the other. I've got my stitch line here on the top side, which I'm lining up with my stitch line on the underside, so that they are married with one another. And I do this all the way down the trouser leg, making sure that I'm not creating any bubbles on either side. Both sides laying flat against one another. Come into one stitch line and come out the stitch line on the other side, like that. So you're in there and you're out on the same stitch line. And you can see here how our line is starting to form all the way along. Do this on the inside and on the outside. Something to note when you're pinning in the top of the fork, so this is the inside leg, you want the cloth at the very top to be level. So if this is the seat seam coming from the top side and then the underside, the very top of the fork on both sides are level.
How do I pin the pocket area?
You're pinning only the layer that doesn't make up the actual mouth of the pocket to the trouser itself. So you're pinning this flap here, not that one there. So you're literally just going like that, pushing that out the way, and then pinning it to your line on the other side.
Okay.
We've got a little problem here. So something to avoid happening, what you don't want to do is gather any excess length in your seam. So if you've accidentally gathered a little bit of length in there, like that, then just undo your pins and repin along to make sure that everything's sitting flat against itself. And so when you're pinning, you want to make sure that you're pinning all the way down to the very bottom. As you can tell now, we've pinned either side of the seam so that everything is now secured in place momentarily. And we're going to hand stitch the very top over here where the pocket bag is in place, simply because if you are doing it by machine, it's that much more difficult to get into these little nooks and crannies without, as we mentioned previously, catching the edge of your pocket in. We're going to begin by grabbing a needle and a thread, and we're going to back stitch from the end of the pocket up to the top of the waistband, and we back stitch it inside the mark that we made. So making sure that everything's lying flat. We begin here at the very base of the bag, back tack a few times. And so as I'm sewing this, I want to make sure that it's only catching the layer of fabric that lays beneath the pocket mouth opening and the layer of fabric on the underside. I don't want to be catching this fold here, which makes up the pocket mouth opening itself. So when I'm stitching, I'm feeling where that pocket mouth opening is, and I'm just shoving it out of the way ever so slightly as I sew along. And sewing that all into place. And I can feel that I'm not catching my pocket mouth opening. Now, as you come into a pin, you can remove it. Now, coming into the very top of the trouser is a little bit tricky. So just make sure that you're holding it in such a way that it can be sewn comfortably. And then we come into the very top of the band and secure right as far as your fingers can get in. So I'm now going to back tack and now double check my work. So open the trouser up, and here you can see that I've stitched it nicely in place. I haven't caught the pocket mouth opening, so I can go back in now and do a second layer of back stitching just to secure that in well and truly. Now for the second time, we're going to double check our work, make sure that we've done that correctly. So flip the leg out and have a look. As you can see there, that pocket is now sewn into place, isn't going anywhere, and we haven't caught our pocket mouth opening. And so now we can do the rest of the leg. So this part is a lot easier. Just like on your centre back seam, you're going to back stitch from where you started all the way down to the very bottom of the hem of the trouser along this white stitch line. And then the same for the inside leg, starting at the fork and then back stitching from the very top all the way down on your white stitch line to the bottom of the trouser. And repeat on the other side. We're going to be machining this because we can't be asked, but for you at home, we empathise. Right, so we are now all stitched up. When it comes to inlays left in the trouser, you don't want more than 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches left at any point. So you can see how initially here there was 1.5 inches left over, and we've taken it in so that now there is 2.5 inches left over on this seam. On the outside leg, there's 1.5 inches there, but we can still trim it back a little bit more. Trimming it back means that you can't let it out back to its original line anymore, but it means that the seams in your trouser, once they're pressed open, will be less disturbed. So what we're going to do here is trim all the inlays back so that none of them are bigger than 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches. At the bottom, we're also going to trim the length of our trouser 4 inches past the hem that we're going to turn them up to. So we'll start with that. So we're 25 3/4 from the inseam. So we go to the inseam, come down to 25 3/4 there, and then that's approximately where our line is. We're going to add 4 inches and cut that straight across. Do the same on the other leg. Then we're going to make a mark. So at the bottom here, we've got 1.25 inches inlay left over. And over here, we've got 2.5 inches left over. So we're going to take it down to 1.25 inches all the way along. So that means that we need to snip off all of that. Now the same thing is going to happen here as did on our centre back seam, which is that we no longer have the overlocking in place. So we're going to serge it just like we did for our centre back. Now on the side seam of our trouser, at the dip here in the flare, what can happen is your inlay can get what's called tight, which is where there's too much left over and it starts disturbing the leg line on the outside. So we're going to leave no more than 3/4 inch over here. And down to the bottom, we're going to leave whatever's left over. This means that if we need to, and if Luka's unhappy with the new leg line, we can always tweak it and let it out some more. So we've still got malleability in there. And the same up here, we're going to leave 3/4 inch coming all the way. So if we need to let it out again, then we still have a little bit of wiggle room. There we go. So I'm just going to trim that back now. Great. So do that same thing exactly on the other leg, and where the overlocking has been cut off, we're going to hand serge like on the centre back. So we'll press the seams open first. In our case, we unpicked all the seams in the trouser, so we don't have to undo the original stitches. But if you made alterations to the trouser which didn't necessitate that, like we indicated earlier on, then you would have to undo the original stitch in order to open the seams up. So we'll start by pressing these open and make sure you're pulling the seam completely out and you're giving it a nice press on the new stitch line. Helps to add a little bit of water. Have you had any pressing accidents, Phoebe?
Luckily, no. Sometimes the steam gets a bit spicy. I know. No. The steam gets a bit spicy and I forget to
Did you tip one over?
press the... Yeah, I did do that. I did tip an iron over. Yeah, I was just leaning on the chestboard and then turns out it wasn't bolted to the floor. Rightly so.
Did you manage to pick it up?
Me and someone else did, yeah. It was a two-man job. Two-man job to pick it up, one-man job to push it over.
Nice.
But yeah.
Strong pet game.
Yep. But yeah, I think other than the loud crash, I had no fatal injuries.
Cute. Right, so outside leg now. So everything on the other side this time is laying flat. Bring everything out. And then start pressing. Right, so to do the top part, it's good to get the end of your ironing board and to put your trouser leg into that. So ideally you do this over what's called a tailor's ham, but we're doing it with the same tools that you're going to have at home, so we're not cheating. Great. Once that's done, and you're satisfied with the process, you can press them on the right side. So lay your trouser flat and then perfect that press once more. You need to be really careful that your iron isn't too hot at this stage. So again, be mindful of its temperature as you're going along. And keep the pocket bag out of the way so it doesn't create any marks that we don't want. And moving your iron stops any shoe marks from becoming apparent on the cloth. Flip it and do exactly the same thing. Right, once that's done, we're going to serge the inlays. So we turn the trouser back inside out, and then we'll serge or overcast all of the areas that we've cut the overlocking off of. We're having some very gay iced coffee.
Black Americano. Yeah, trying to find the tension on this is like...
Yeah, it needs to be fairly loose.
Yeah, so it doesn't...
Yeah.
So it doesn't scruple.
Exactly. There you go. Okay. And then we do exactly the same thing to the other side, everywhere where we've lost our overlocking. And then repeat on the other leg. We have now got an almost finished pair of trousers. Side seams done, inside leg done. We now need to just finish off the stitch to connect our seat seam back together now that we've taken in the fork. Fairly simple. We put one leg inside the other and flip them out. And we simply stitch our seat seam back in from where we undid it over there to where we undid it over here, all the way through in one straight line connecting both cut ends. You might need to undo some more gubbins to get in there. Just take that out, and then I just do it by hand. Makes it easier. So you're just making sure that both those inlays there are laying flat. You can do it on the edge of your ironing board. Shove it on there. And then we're literally just going to pin this to here. That to there. And I'll tack over here. So we mark with a chalk where the tacks are undone, and we backstitch between those lines, connecting them both together in one swoop run. Bit difficult to draw, you get the gist of it. And tacking all the way into that line that hasn't yet been unpicked. Take our pins out and then backstitch on that same line for the sakes of security. There. So I can now back tack and press the seam open. So get it on the edge of your board, a little bit of water. Just press that open. Once that's done, we take this little bit of lining here, which got a bit scrunched up by the previous owner, and then we're very simply going to tack it down into place on this edge. I'm only catching the seam allowances, I'm not catching the top cloth itself, and I'm felling it down to keep it in place. Et voila. Now, we've got two final things to do. One is to press the trousers and press in the new crease. And the second is to do up the hem. So in order to find the new crease, we want the crease at the top here, because they're a pleated pair, to stay exactly where they were originally. We're going to tweak it coming down the leg, potentially. We'll have a look at that in a second. If you have a flat front pair of trousers, your crease stops at the crotch in any case, so you don't have to worry about where it is at the top. Lay our trousers flat. And if you're right-handed, you want the iron to press into the leg, so you want the top of the trouser to be facing away from you. And we're simply going to fold one leg at the top like this, and we're going to pin the inseam of the trouser at the knee in the same location as the outseam of the knee of the trouser. So I put my pin in the seam there, and it's coming through that same seam on the other side, so they're centered. And we do exactly the same thing at the bottom, pinning one seam on top of the other, like that. We then lay the trouser flat as it wants to lie on the board. And ideally, you can lift the pocket bag out as well, like that. And ideally, things should progress very gradually into your original pleat line over here. I'm just going to pop a pin in there to hold it all in place. So our crease line here doesn't look like it needs to move very much. Sometimes if you make drastic alterations, it can need a considerable shift. But in fact, over here, it looks like we can keep it exactly where it's at. Now that we've got our trouser in place, we can start laying in the crease. We're going to spray on some water, and we're going to simply press that crease where it wants to lie. And then just kick that out of the way and go ahead, leave that bunching in there and just let it lie naturally, and stop pressing the crease once you get to the height of the crotch over here. Then flip the trouser over, removing these pins beforehand, and press the crease from the other side this time. Now, next stage is to hem the bottoms. So we want to measure again to the bottom of the trouser. So 25 3/4 from the inseam, like this, 25 3/4. We've already trimmed all of the inlays. We've only left 4 inches there. And Luka only needs a straight bottom all the way along. Now, traditionally speaking, you would have a slight slant. Your toe would be 1 inch higher than your heel. But when we pinned on Luka, we noticed that it wasn't a necessity for him, given that he wanted something that was going to sit above the shoe and not rest on it. So we're going to leave things as they are. We then add a little chalk mark past the crease on both sides, and then we transfer that line over. So in order to turn up the trouser, grab some basting cotton and baste the hem of the trouser on that line. And then once you've done the very bottom, back tack once, and then you're going to turn the leg inside out and do exactly the same thing, but this time at the top of the inlay. And then the last thing to do, hem stitch, which is similar in many ways to your serge. So you knot your thread on a single, start off at one of the seams, tack off, and then catch one tiny little thread on the trouser itself. So I'll show that again. You're going to come onto the trouser itself, so past the inlay, and you're going to catch one tiny little thread like that. So you can see that little tiny thread that's been caught, and then your needle comes into the inlay and back out, and you repeat that as you go along. One tiny little thread like that, and then back into the inlay, back out, and you keep doing that all along. So once you've finished your hem stitch, you can then remove that baste and press the hem of your trouser in. So we start with pressing the very base all the way around. Then laying the trouser flat and pressing in the crease either side. Do the same on the other side. And then we're going to give the trouser a final full press.